In 1944, the Ardennes region of Belgium was the frontier between Nazi Germany and the Allies. On December 16th, 250,000 German troops launched a shattering surprise offensive here. 500,000 Americans, the majority of the Allied force, were engulfed in what would become the greatest land battle ever fought by American troops in the 20th century. The Ardennes offensive began as a success for Hitler, but would end up, after the Battle of the Bulge, as a total defeat for Germany. Battlefield detectives will investigate why. Following the Allied landings on D-Day, June 6, 1944, German forces in Western Europe have been pushed back to the borders of Hitler's Germany. After 6 months of hard but successful fighting, the Allied troops settle into winter quarters and prepare for the expected invasion of Germany in spring 1945. The quietest sector of the front is the Ardennes region, known to the Allies as the Ghost Front.
It was seen as a ghost front because it was the nice, quiet part of the line where no attacks would come from. But it was also the ghost front because it's kind of a spooky place to be in the mornings when the steam is rising up out of the forests and it gets that eerie look about it.
Holding this remote stretch of the front were just 60,000 troops, mainly Americans.
The Ardennes were considered to be a quiet place, a place in which divisions that had been badly damaged, had taken many losses in earlier battles, could be put there for rest, recovery, replacement, the training of replacements. But also it was a place where newly arrived divisions from the United States could be placed in to have the sort of their first experience.
It was this ghost front that the Germans chose for a surprise attack. Before dawn on the morning of December 16th, Sergeant B.O. Wilkins of the U.S. 99th Division beheld an unearthly sight.
The entire sky was flooded with floodlights. It was light. On the mist and the fog and everything, it came directly across, and it was just like daylight practically with all of the light. Nothing was happening at the time, it was just lights. About that time, the artillery barrage started.
The Nazi artillery barrage lasted more than an hour. Behind it, waiting to attack, was a massive force of more than 250,000 German troops. Among them was assault gun commander Hans Baumann.
We were very apprehensive before the offensive began. But the moment we went into battle, all the fear went. You were free of it, because you were finally going into what you'd been preparing for.
The German objective was to break through this weakly held Allied line before crossing the River Meuse to capture the vital Allied supply port of Antwerp. The Allies found themselves in a desperate situation. The German offensive had taken them completely by surprise. Peter Caddick-Adams of the Royal Military College of Science is trying to find out how they were able to do this. First, he wants to discover how the Germans went about concealing their preparations for this huge offensive.
If we look at the Battle of the Bulge from the German point of view, it's a story of great success in terms of preparing for the battle and second-guessing the Allies. The Germans have worked out that the Allies, the British, the Americans and so on, think that the Germans have lost the war, that they are a spent force, and that all their preparations for the Bulge offensive therefore go along with that idea.
Knowing that the Allies had broken German codes, Hitler chose a code name for his Ardennes offensive that would mislead Allied intelligence.
So the Germans create a code name for the Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, which reflects their understanding of the Allies' view of the war, which is that the Germans will defend the Rhine and create an armoured reserve of men and tanks ready to repel any British-American attack across the Rhine and therefore into Germany to finish the war.
Allied intelligence gatherers believed Watch on the Rhine was a defensive operation, not an attack. Very few German generals were privy to the plan. Hitler subjected those that were to extreme security measures.
When the German generals are first introduced to the idea, they're seated at a table. Behind each chair is an SS trooper, and the first piece of paper they have to sign is a document which states that they will not pass on any of the secrets, they won't discuss the operation outside the room, and they will be under the rules of Sippenhaft if they do. And Sippenhaft means that if you're guilty of an indiscretion, your family can suffer as well as you. So it's not just a case of a German general being shot. His family would go to a concentration camp. And if you apply that rule all the way down, then your operational security is going to be very good indeed, and it is.
The threats worked. German internal security was watertight. But once Nazi troops began to assemble in the field, how did the Allies fail to notice a buildup of more than 250,000 men? Cadec Adams suspects some of these troop movements may have been detected, but their significance at the time went unnoticed. Allied codebreakers cracked the German Enigma code in these huts. It's hoped that by sifting through records here, our detectives might turn up relevant records about the Ardennes offensive, if they existed at all. Former intelligence analyst Brian Oakley and Cadec Adams searched through decrypts, decoded messages of German radio traffic intercepted by the Allies just prior to the Ardennes campaign.
You remember that Hitler has ordered a radio silence. The very fact that we've got all these decrypts shows that it was only partly effective, but it probably was stopping us getting...
They do find something. It's a decrypt from a series of extremely secret reports, codenamed Purple, containing traffic between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan.
The Purple decrypts were the Japanese ambassador decrypts. Bletchley was very lucky in that the Americans had given us the great gift of their method of breaking into the Purple decrypts. They'd done that in the dark days of 1940. And if one looks in the details, you find that he's talking about an offensive to be executed with the sole objective of stabilizing a front.
This is amazing. So this is the 10th of September, and Hitler's told the Japanese ambassador the whole story.
It's an extraordinary find. Hitler could do nothing to prevent his Japanese allies breaking radio discipline. But Cadec Adams is looking for clues that portrayed the presence of German troops on the ground before the attack.
And are there any telltale signs for some of their elite or better-known divisions in all these decrypts?
Yes, SS, Battle Group 1 and 12 Sugar divisions, that's SS divisions.
So they identify them.
Yeah.
Exactly the opposite. I mean, Sugar sounds so benign, and yet there they are. There it is signifying SS, the elite and the hard men of the German army.
Right. And
it's another vital clue that Allied intelligence missed.
Looking at the decrypts that we've seen at Bletchley Park, there are perhaps 300 clues there that the Germans are about to launch an attack. The clues are there.
Why then did they not draw what with hindsight seems the obvious conclusion?
The trouble is, in the autumn and winter of 1944, with the Germans on the run, you can interpret those clues in two ways. You can say, yes, this is all part of a German counteroffensive that's about to fall on the West and we need to prepare for it. Or you can say, these are over-optimistic interpretations of isolated individuals. This is Hitler boasting to the Japanese, for example. And collectively, we shouldn't take these too seriously because really the Germans don't have this capability.
With the war in Europe nearly won, Allied intelligence analysts saw only what they expected to see. In mid-December 1944, they also had no aerial photographs of the Ardennes to support the radio traffic decrypts. Bad weather meant Allied surveillance aircraft were grounded. Was this sheer good luck for the Germans? Or was an attack in bad weather always part of Hitler's plan? British climatologist Craig Rich is investigating the weather patterns of this region and how the Germans used them to their advantage. On the North Shoulder, near the German border, he finds conditions very similar to those on the day Hitler launched his offensive.
These are exactly the conditions that Hitler's armies, and of course the Allied armies, faced on the morning of 16th of December 1944. Early in the morning, a lot of mist, fog, the front coming in, little gaps here and there, but by and large, very poor visibility.
Documentary sources reveal that Hitler planned a winter offensive to increase the chances of Allied aircraft being unable to fly. Craig Rich believes that the bad weather that coincided with the start of the campaign was more than just Hitler's good luck. He's discovered that Hitler was using meteorology to help him time his attack. But at this time, sophisticated weather forecasting methods were still in their infancy.
Of course, in 1944, we didn't have such things as satellites. But the only way you can forecast weather is to get information. The wind direction, the wind speed, temperatures, how much rainfall, cloud cover, and so on.
Rich has found where the Germans obtained this information.
Now, what Hitler and his troops would have wanted, as we know, is inclement weather, inclement flying weather. So they want mist, they want drizzle, they want rain. Now, what delivers that to the Ardennes are weather fronts coming in off the Atlantic.
U-boats had failed to cripple Allied sea convoys in the Atlantic, and so they were put to a new purpose.
Now, what Hitler did, even after the war in the Atlantic was over, he kept some of his older U-boats out there, and their job was solely to provide him with meteorological data.
It takes 2 to 3 days for a weather system in the North Atlantic to reach the Ardennes. Hitler had been planning the offensive for 3 months, but he only set the date for the attack when the required bad weather was detected out at sea.
Once you get a fairly detailed weather system in the Atlantic and it's moving east, you can be pretty sure what sort of weather it's going to deliver to Western Europe. He would have had early warning from his U-boats that that weather was on the way.
Hitler had only to wait for bad weather, while almost 250,000 German soldiers were massed, ready to storm through the Ardennes. Aided by heavy mist and snowfalls, thousands of German troops pour across the front line. Allied troops are taken completely by surprise and are outnumbered almost 4 to 1. In the south, U.S. troops in the town of Bastogne are surrounded and cut off by the Germans. With Christmas approaching, the siege becomes the focus of media attention in America.
By far the most dramatic story for Americans back home is the story of what's happening around Bastogne, because you have American units that are surrounded there. And so it understandably becomes the focus of attention, but the real battle or the real threat from the Germans is actually going on up north of Bastogne.
The U.S. 99th Division was one of the Allied units in this northern sector of the Ardennes, known as the North Shoulder. Dug in on the edge of a wood, Sergeant Wilkins' men were among the first to be attacked.
I looked down to my left, and I saw some Germans. They had a Panzerfaust. They were getting ready to fire at our hole where we were. Well, I fired a few shots down there and dispersed them. And then I started to get out of the hole, and I heard somebody yelling at us to surrender.
The squad was quickly surrounded, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of German troops.
And we saw them coming out with their hands on their helmets. They were surrendering. This was a machine gun squad and another half rifle squad. So we said, well, maybe they're serious. We better surrender.
Many more Allied troops were captured by the Germans in these desperate opening stages, including more than 7,500 men of the 106th Division. one of the largest mass surrenders of American troops in history. Some of these troops were experienced veterans, and yet even they were surprised by the German shock attack. Military geologist Peter Doyle believes study of the terrain may help to explain why this initial German attack was so successful. Much of the north shoulder of the Ardennes is heavily forested. It was in this dense woodland that the Allied troops, including the 99th Division, were suddenly bombarded and then attacked by the German infantry. He teams up with Dutch author Hans Wiegers.
You see a piece of iron over here.
Okay.
An expert on these battlefields, Wiegers will help Doyle try to make sense of what traces they can find on the ground.
It's amazing to see you find now any clothing. This is American blanket. Part of an American blanket is still laying in a foxhole.
But it's the remains of their fighting positions that will help him understand the battle. These foxholes and bunkers are positions dug by Allied troops during the battle.
It gives a sense of confusion that we've in this forest.
I mean, even in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, it was a complete chaos, not knowing who was your neighbor. I mean, sometimes they looked in another foxhole. Was a German already in there? I mean, it was
terrifying with the shell fire above, the fog, the blanket of snow, and not knowing if in the next foxhole you've got your friend or your foe.
Mm-hmm. The positions are scattered through the woods. It's difficult now to see which direction they were intended to defend against. So Doyle conducts a survey to see if he can learn anything from their overall layout. Later, when he plots the positions on the computer, Doyle finds that there was no one single orientation.
It's difficult to pick out any kind of an orientation. There are some linear orientations, maybe of one or two of the major aid post bunkers, but the rest of it is just a confused mass of small foxholes. It gives a real idea of the confusion of those opening stages of the battle, really.
In confused fighting, Allied troops were disoriented and so were quickly surrounded and overrun. The evidence suggests that the German surprise attack was aided by the densely wooded terrain. But that's not all the Allies were up against. Even at this late stage of the war, German military technology still led the world. Hitler placed increasing faith in wonder weapons, including jet aircraft and V-1 rockets, both of which were used in the Ardennes offensive. On the ground, too, a new weapon caused problems for troops like the U.S. 99th Division. German troops in the attack were equipped with the MP-44 Sturmgewehr. Stephen Bull has studied many of the weapons used by the German army in World War II. Now he wants to find out more about the Sturmgewehr, also known as the MP-44.
An assault rifle, or literally Sturmgewehr, is a weapon that the individual infantryman can use during the advance and give him the edge in terms of firepower over the opposition.
A new concept in weaponry, the Sturmgewehr combined two distinct types of infantry weapons.
The assault rifle is neither submachine gun, nor is it an ordinary rifle. It, if you like, takes two concepts, puts two and two together and makes five. It's a good weapon for performing the task that the submachine gun would perform at close range, and it's also a perfectly adequate semi-automatic rifle at distances of up to about 600 meters.
For a comparison, Bull first wants to see what kind of Allied weapon the Sturmgewehr was up against. The BAR, or Browning Automatic Rifle, had been in service with the U.S. Army since World War I.
So we'll see how it goes standing up.
Heavy and unwieldy, the BAR was unpopular with troops. Its small magazine contained only 20 rounds. meaning it constantly had to be reloaded. It was also notorious for jamming. By contrast, the Sturmgewehr is light and easy to handle. Its curved magazine contains 30 rounds, 10 more than the Allied BAR.
The Sturmgewehr must have been a very nasty surprise for some of the people who faced it the first time round. And for some of the people who used it, it would have been something of a dream. Because having smaller, lighter cartridges, each infantryman could carry 1.5 times the number of rounds that he could before. And not only could he carry 1.5 times the number of rounds, he could fire them roughly 3 times as quickly.
For the U.S. troops of the 99th Division, many of whom fought from log-reinforced trenches and bunkers, it was devastating.
That is quite remarkable. Through 6 inches of wood, through a piece of hardboard, straight through the paper target. We can see here holes of several different sizes. What's happened is that the bullets have tumbled as they've come through the wood and torn off splinters as they've gone through. These larger holes here are almost certainly bullets as they turn sideways and spin through the target. If this was a man, this would be an appalling wound.
The Sturmgewehr was a highly effective weapon. But was it a major reason for German success early on in the Ardennes offensive?
The Sturmgewehr, it was a fantastic design. Something new, something different, something innovative, revolutionary even. But they just never had enough of them to really make that difference.
In late 1944, the Sturmgewehr was still in short supply. Its manufacture disrupted by Allied bombing. Despite the Germans' early successes in the initial confused fighting, infantry weapons alone would not be enough to maintain the momentum of their Ardennes offensive. December 16, 1944, Hitler's Ardennes offensive is underway. To the south, the German attack has driven a deep bulge into the Allied lines. But the crucial area is the North Shoulder. It's here that the outcome of the battle will be decided.
In the first few hours of the German attack, most American commanders did not recognize the attack as a major attack. And then later on, as the day wore on, and certainly by the end of the day, then they began to realize that this truly was a significant attack, and by the second day, then there's great alarm is spreading through some parts of the Allied High Command.
After the infantry attack, the Germans unleashed their most feared troops, armored panzer divisions. The panzers were to cut swiftly through the north of the Ardennes, capture vital river crossings, and take the Allied port of Antwerp. Their spearhead was led by highly decorated SS commander Jochen Peiper.
He was good-looking, he was charismatic, he was everything you did not expect an SS man to look like. He wasn't tall, he wasn't broad or brawny. He was allegedly extremely courteous. He was a highly experienced, highly decorated officer.
Though he was only 29 years old, Peiper was revered by his soldiers. Hans Baumann served in the Waffen-SS during the Ardennes offensive.
Jochen Peiper was known as a very good leader. He was beloved by his troops, one of the best we ever had. Everybody agreed. He was one of the best commanders we had.
Peiper's men were up against weakened and disrupted Allied troops. But after 2 days of heavy fighting, the attack was behind schedule. What was going wrong? Peter Doyle will try to find out. He believes terrain once more played a vital role. He's retracing the exact route taken by Peiper's tanks in December 1944. It was challenging country for the German tank crews.
Up here on the high ground, it's really possible to see just how steep the slopes were, and it's particularly so now that these trees have been cleared away. we can really get a sense of what the Ardennes is all about. These steep ridges and deep valleys. And it was through these that the Germans were trying to punch their way through the American army, the weak point in the front.
The SS crews were used to rapid blitzkrieg attacks through open country, such as in Russia, not heavily wooded hills like these.
The real problem Piper was facing was that people think of armoured forces in a mad sort of cavalry-like charge across open country. It isn't like that in the Ardennes. Piper was advancing on a single road through a forest. And so all this armour is actually not much use at this stage. He's not going to get to open country for a long, long time. The other problem with the Ardennes from Piper's point of view was that you've got rivers, you've got the Amblève River in particular. He's got to get decent bridges.
It's bridges like this one that the Germans were trying to get over in 1944. And this bridge, built on the site of an original one, is built to the same dimensions. It's barely wide enough to get a modern-day truck across, never mind a 69-ton German armoured vehicle. It must have been incredibly difficult, especially when some of them were made out of wood. If you've got a wooden bridge, how are you going to get this super giant tank across in one piece? Almost impossible.
The race for the bridges led to savage battles in the small Ardennes villages. Piper's men were desperate to make a breakthrough. But Peter Doyle suspects Piper was fighting a losing battle from the start. He studies the overall geology of the north shoulder of the Ardennes.
Having been on the ground and seen the terrain, the topographic elements, the slopes, I knew at that time that it was pretty difficult for the Germans to get through. But now having a look at these maps at a scale which allow us to see the whole of the Ardennes, realised that the Germans really had very little hope of success and that they were really pitching themselves into this maelstrom, really, that we're seeing here. The geology really defines this battle. The terrain is constraining the way in which they can travel.
The Germans intended to travel across the valleys and roadways rather than along them.
We can see that there are very few lines that the Germans could have taken, and once they'd gambled on those and lost, it was hopeless.
But the Germans still had a lethal advantage over the Allies. Hitler's Waffen-SS had first call on many of the new wonder weapons. Piper's troops were equipped with the most advanced tanks of the Second World War. Military vehicle expert David Fletcher is an expert on World War II armor. He studied surviving examples of German tanks from 1944, including the one most feared by Allied troops, the King Tiger.
Well, the importance of the King Tiger came as a great surprise to the Allies. They were first encountered in Normandy, and we had no warning that this tank existed. Hitler prized it as what was in effect his secret modern weapon. And when it first appeared on the battlefield, it literally frightened everyone to death. Bigger gun, larger hull, thicker armour than anything that had been seen before. Absolutely formidable machine in every respect.
On paper, the King Tiger was unbeatable. But on the battlefield in the Ardennes, it was a different matter. In the Tank Museum's archive, David Fletcher has access to a file kept secret during the war. It's an Allied intelligence assessment of the King Tiger compiled from German documents and examinations of captured examples. It seems the truth was somewhat different to the King Tiger's legend. At nearly 65 tons, the King Tiger's sheer size was a drawback.
The tank is big. Therefore, in constricted roads, it becomes a liability. It can't manoeuvre so easily. In wet weather, if it gets off the road, it tears it up, and indeed on unsurfaced roads, it makes a heck of a mess. That might not upset the tank itself, that will get through, but what it leaves behind it is a route that its supply vehicles cannot follow anymore.
Even in ideal conditions, the King Tiger was difficult to maneuver. The hilly, wooded terrain of the Ardennes posed severe problems.
I mean, we're talking about a vehicle which is approaching 70 tons. That is a lot of weight, no matter how it's spread on the tracks. And on narrow roads, on winding roads, that is a terrific problem. It's not just getting the tank through. There is a detrimental effect on the steering gear. Every time you steer, you're testing the gearbox to its limit.
In December 1944, the King Tiger was still relatively new and mechanically temperamental. Just days into the offensive, most were abandoned due to mechanical difficulties. Joachim Peiper's vital attack was running out of steam. The Germans launched their offensive, outnumbering the Allies by more than 3-1. Why, then, were their troops not able to press home victory in the Ardennes offensive? After nearly a week of fighting, the Germans' Ardennes offensive had driven a huge bulge miles into the Allied lines. But Peiper's attack in the north was slowing down. The German offensive was losing momentum. Dr. Stephen Hart of Britain's Royal Military Academy has conducted extensive research into the Wehrmacht. Once the most formidable army in the world, by 1944 it was severely weakened. Hart has found that after 5 years of continuous warfare, the Germans had serious manpower problems. For the Ardennes offensive, they were forced to fill the ranks with a new type of recruit for their infantry. Volksgrenadier, or People's Grenadiers.
The German Ardennes offensive involved a force of about 22 divisions. The bulk of those were Volksgrenadier divisions, or People's Grenadier divisions, the name being a sort of propagandistic device to try and convey the message that this represented the effort of the entire German people in a popular national struggle against the evil allies who were hell-bent on destroying the German nation.
Made up of men over the normal recruitment age, the Volksgrenadier were far from ideal recruits. And there were other deficiencies in manpower.
Some of Peiper's men, the Leibstandarte was reinforced with 3,000 men just before this offensive. Now, those 3,000 were not experienced, they were very young. Some of the tank drivers had never even been in a tank until a month before this advance.
Inexperienced troops could still have been a potent force if well led. Peter Caddick-Adams believes this was another reason for the German defeat in the Battle of the Bulge. As well as recruits, it seems there was a problem with commanders.
The reason for the German success in the first half of the Second World War is the individual initiative given to commanders. They're told what it is they have to achieve, but how they achieve that is entirely up to them. They know the ebb and flow of the battle on the battlefield, leave it up to the commander, and they'll achieve victory. And they do, with spectacular results in France in 1940. Modern military theorists call this mission command.
Yet by 1944, Hitler dominated his commanders.
By the end of the Second World War, in 1944, with increasing control from Hitler, partly because his own army have tried to kill him in July 1944, those commanders aren't given the same loose rein. So when the offensive grinds to a halt, commanders who might have made a difference at that sort of tactical level, commanding companies and battalions on the German side, daren't use their individual initiative to get round problems in the way that military sense would dictate, because of a fear of Hitler's personal control.
Even commanders who were given approval to act on initiative were still constrained by tightly enforced secrecy. Major General Mike Reynolds, who commanded armored troops with NATO, believes Peiper was desperately short of the intelligence he needed to carry out his mission.
Ideally, you should know all the pieces of the puzzle before you launch out on an operation like this. That almost never happens in my experience, and it certainly didn't happen in Peiper's experience in this particular battle. He didn't know where the American units were.
As well as the defending American troops, Peiper also lacked intelligence on another aspect of the Allies' dispositions in the Ardennes, one that above all else proved crucial to the progress of the German offensive. Sergeant Wilkins of the 99th Division got a hint of what this was following his capture by the Germans.
After they had accumulated several hundred of us prisoners the next day and were marching us out, going down the roads, and there was an enormous amount of panzers back there waiting to get up to the front. What looked to me like a Tiger tank was pulling a Panther tank, which was pulling a half-track loaded down with SS troops, because they didn't have enough gasoline, and they realized they weren't going to have enough gasoline to last to go to where they wanted to go, to Antwerp.
In 1944, the German army was desperately short of fuel for tanks and vehicles.
Well, Piper started with his hands tied behind his back in a way. His tanks only had enough fuel to get halfway to the Meuse, that's all. He had to be resupplied or he had to capture fuel.
But Piper had no information where that fuel might be.
Of course, the chief problem in achieving these orders was that the Germans lacked a lot of intelligence about the enemy because of the excessive secrecy that had dominated the entire planning of the offensive, which is why Battle Group Piper, for example, drove past one of the largest Allied fuel depots in the region, less than a mile away, without even knowing it was there.
Even when Allied fuel was captured, the difficulties did not end for German tank crews. David Fletcher considers how long it would have taken to refuel a King Tiger's 227-gallon fuel tank.
Well, just an example, there is the equivalent of a 5-gallon jerry can. Look at the size of this thing. Just imagine how many of these you're going to have to put in, and the tanks are on both sides, in order to top up the tanks and get anywhere. So these things are coming up by the truckload. They're being dumped on the ground, and then crew members are slinging them up to the guy up here who's refueling them. He's got to open each can, tip it up, wait while it drains down into the tank, get rid of that one, start again with the next one. It is a long, drawn-out process. Dangerous process because you're usually somewhere where the enemy's not far away, and you can't even smoke to steady your nerves.
Unfortunately for Piper, the Allies were able to destroy most of their fuel dumps before the Germans found them.
Piper did refuel some of his tanks along the way, but to the extent that the attack depended on capturing American supplies, it failed.
Now desperate for fuel, Piper's men resorted to unconventional supply methods.
They tried floating jerry cans down the Amblève. They tried resupplying by air, and it dropped. Of course, by this time, Piper was surrounded, and almost all the fuel they dropped landed on the Americans and not within his perimeter. So Piper literally had no chance of getting to the Meuse. And the initial plan was faulty in that respect. They didn't have the wherewithal to get him there.
By December 22nd, the armored spearhead troops of Hitler's offensive were isolated and trapped. Now they would experience for themselves a savage surprise attack. After 10 days of bitter fighting, Allied troops in the northern Ardennes have stopped the German armored attack. His men exhausted and his tanks out of fuel, SS Colonel Piper's force is surrounded by American troops in the small Belgian village of La Glaise.
Well, Piper was holed up in La Glaise, and by then, of course, he's got a very depleted force. He's only got some 800 to 1,000 men there. And the Americans, they're constantly shelling him and mortaring him.
It was the end of the road for Kampfgruppe Piper.
Piper knows it's hopeless, and eventually he receives permission to pull out.
Piper's failure on the North Shoulder was a major setback for the Germans, affecting the morale of the whole army.
In the first few days, the Vormarsch, the attack, went well. We were very confident of victory. But when we ran out of gas and then heard Piper had to blow up 80 of his own tanks because there was no fuel, our hopes for victory came to an end as well.
The opening phase of the Ardennes offensive had been successful for the Germans. Now, as the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the stage was set for the eventual German defeat. But in the south, German troops still besieged the strategically important town of Bastogne. American troops, including 6,000 men of the 101st Airborne, had held out against heavy odds since the start of the offensive. Leading the Allied force hell-bent on relieving the troops in Bastogne was one of the most celebrated generals in U.S. military history.
General George S. Patton is the American general who is most feared by the Germans. He is inspirational. Part of his inspiration is how visible he was and how flamboyant he was and how profane he should be. At the same time, he is a thoroughly professional soldier.
Well, Patton was a remarkable man. He was a cavalryman, and he employs cavalry tactics, which you could equate slightly to blitzkrieg. And Patton is the sort of man who doesn't care much about casualties. It's get up and go, attack, attack, attack. He doesn't believe in defense.
Patton demonstrated this talent for mobility and speed by wheeling his entire Third Army north to counterattack the German flank and race to relieve the siege of Bastogne. It was an extraordinary maneuver.
In making a major move or a change in direction for an army of tens of thousands, or in the case of the three divisions that Patton sent to relieve Bastogne, where you're talking about upwards to 50,000 men, and think of all of their vehicles and supplies and food and ammunition.
A major battlefield move of this complexity didn't just happen. It took a huge amount of planning. Professor Tom Hatfield has researched Patton's role in the Bulge campaign. He believes the American general was able to carry out the huge move so smoothly because he was so well prepared.
Patton was known for paying very careful attention to intelligence reports. If you went back to see Eisenhower, it is well known that he would take some extra time to stay and have discussions with intelligence officers. So in October of '44, a full 2 months before the German attack, Patton is beginning to suspect that something is wrong over in the area which became the originating point for the German attack, that things are too quiet over there.
Though most of the Allies' intelligence services, like Station X at Bletchley Park, failed to detect the German buildup, Patton's suspicions led him to prepare for the worst.
Patton directed his operations staff to prepare some operational plans, and one of those was the possibility of a German breakthrough that would come in the Ardennes, and how the Third Army, Patton's Third Army, would be able to respond.
And amazingly, when he gets the orders to do just that, within 48 hours, he's turned his army round.
Patton's uncanny instinct for war paid off. On December 26th, Allied troops in Bastogne were relieved. It would come to be known as the most famous action of the Battle of the Bulge. But for veterans like Sergeant Wilkins of the 99th Division, the real deciding action had been fought earlier in those desperate first hours in the northern Ardennes.
We were the ones who defeated Hitler's proposal to go to Antwerp, because the spearhead was supposed to go right through us, and they were trying to wipe us out so that the tanks could come through. It was the most important battle of the big battle of the Bulge.
By January 28, 1945, the Ardennes Offensive was over. It was the largest German attack Western Europe had seen. Its sudden ferocity had sent Allied forces reeling, at first threatening to be a devastating success for Hitler. But after 6 weeks of heavy fighting, the outcome was an overwhelming victory for the Allies, a victory with heavy consequences for Hitler's Germany.
The Battle of the Bulge was the largest land battle ever fought by the United States, and that's true even today. It was highly significant in that it bled the Germans. A lot of their finest troops died or were crippled, and they lost an immense amount of equipment. This hastened the end of the war, without any doubt.
The price was almost 100,000 American casualties.
As Churchill said, it is to the American homes that the telegrams are being sent. That is, the telegrams about the dead and the wounded. And therefore, it's one of the most important events of World War II, in the American mind.
With the final defeat of Germany less than 5 months away, the Battle of the Bulge was the last great German offensive in the West.